Ethan Callahan was no ordinary archaeologist. For years, his name had been whispered among circles of explorers who dared to venture into the world's most dangerous and forbidden sites. But Ethan carried a darkness with him, one he tried to bury beneath years of accolades and discoveries. It had been 10 years since his sister, Elise, vanished under inexplicable circumstances during one of his expeditions. Though the official reports called it an accident, Ethan knew the truth. Something beyond this world had taken her. This time, his search for answers led him to the isolated Raven Grove Mountains, a region shrouded in eerie legends and ominous warnings. Locals whispered about the Cave of Night's Echo, a place said to consume the souls of those who dared enter. The villagers refused to even point Ethan in the right direction, leaving him to rely on an ancient, half-burned map he had acquired in a black market auction. The map was marked with cryptic symbols and a single chilling phrase in Latin, Omnia somnia redunt, all dreams return. The journey to the cave was treacherous. Thick mist curled through the air, twisting around Ethan and his team like ghostly fingers. The forest that surrounded the mountain was unnervingly silent, the absence of birds or insects amplifying every crack of a twig underfoot. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as though afraid to disturb whatever lurked in the shadows. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every time he turned around, there was nothing but the endless expanse of skeletal trees. When they finally reached the entrance, a wave of nausea hit the group. The cave loomed before them, its jagged opening resembling the maw of a great beast. Strange carvings adorned the stone walls, glowing faintly in the dim light. Ethan traced his fingers over the symbols, feeling an unnatural warmth radiating from them. The sensation was unsettling, like the hum of a living pulse. One of his team members, Maria, gasped. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the cave floor. There, etched in the dirt, were footprints, bare and impossibly large. They didn't lead out of the cave, but seemed to vanish into the darkness within. Ethan's heart began to race as an icy chill gripped him. "I don't think these are human," Maria added, her voice trembling. Ethan adjusted his headlamp, peering into the inky blackness. The beam of light seemed to be swallowed whole, revealing only a narrow corridor that spiraled downward. The air grew colder with every step they took, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of their breathing and the faint drip of water echoing in the distance. And then came the whispers. David's scream shattered the silence, but when he turned around, the back seat was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of his engine and the erratic pounding of his heart. The road ahead stretched on, inviting him to continue, or perhaps daring him not to. At first, they were faint, barely distinguishable from the ambient noise of the cave. But as they ventured deeper, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Ethan could almost make out words, though they were spoken in a language he didn't recognize. The voices seemed to echo all around them, yet when he spun his light to find the source, there was nothing. "I don't like this," said Greg, another team member. His voice was tight with fear. "It's like the cave is alive." Ethan didn't respond. He was too focused on the growing sense of dread pooling in his chest. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, a primal instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he couldn't, not when he was this close to uncovering the truth. As they pressed on, the symbols on the walls grew more intricate, more menacing. Some depicted humanoid figures writhing in torment, their faces contorted in agony. Others showed strange, amorphous entities towering over them, their shapes shifting and indistinct. Ethan's hand trembled as he reached out to touch one particularly grotesque carving. The moment his fingers brushed the stone, a deafening roar filled the cavern. It wasn't the roar of an animal, but something deeper, more guttural, like the earth itself was crying out in pain. The ground beneath them began to shake, sending loose rocks tumbling from the ceiling. And then, from the depths of the cave, a shadow emerged, something massive and moving in unnatural jerks. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat. Whatever it wasn't human, and it was coming for them. "Run," he shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. But as they turned to flee, the entrance they had come through was gone, replaced by a solid wall of stone. Ethan's mind raced as the whispers returned, louder than ever, forming a single chilling sentence: "You cannot escape your dreams." The cavern swallowed them whole. As Ethan and his team ventured deeper, an oppressive stillness blanketed the air, thick and suffocating. The beam of Ethan's flashlight wavered as though the darkness itself resisted its intrusion. Every sound, a shuffle of boots on stone, a faint exhale, echoed unnaturally, twisting into distorted whispers that faded as quickly as they began. The symbols carved into the walls seemed to shift when no one was looking, their shapes pulsating faintly like a warning in a language long forgotten. Ethan's pulse quickened when his flashlight flickered. A cold breath brushed against the back of his neck, sending a shiver down his spine. "Did you feel that?" he whispered, but the team behind him didn't answer. When he turned to look, his heart nearly stopped. They were gone. The passage that should have stretched back to the entrance was now a solid wall of stone. Panic clawed at his chest as he spun around, only to realize that the narrow corridor had expanded into a vast chamber. The air was frigid, and the walls seemed to breathe, exhaling a low, resonant hum that vibrated in his ears. At the center of the chamber stood a strange formation, a jagged obelisk of black stone, its surface etched with symbols that glowed faintly red, as though veins of molten lava ran just beneath. Ethan approached cautiously, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. As he neared the obelisk, a sudden wave of nausea hit him, and the chamber seemed to tilt and warp. His vision blurred, and the ground beneath his feet turned soft, like stepping into wet clay. He stumbled forward, his fingers brushing against the stone. The moment he made contact, the room erupted into chaos. A deafening sound tore through the air, a mix of human screams and inhuman growls. Shadows leapt from the walls, swirling and twisting into grotesque forms that defied logic. Ethan clutched his head as the whispers from earlier returned, louder and more coherent this time, overlapping in an unholy cacophony. "Face it! Face it! Face it!" the voices chanted. Suddenly, the shadows coalesced into a figure, a towering, shapeless mass of darkness with glowing, ember-like eyes that burned with malice. Ethan tried to step back, but his feet were rooted in place. The figure extended a long, tendril-like arm toward him, and as it did, Ethan's surroundings changed. He was no longer in the chamber. He was in his childhood home. The warm, familiar smell of his mother's cooking filled the air, and sunlight streamed through the windows. But something was wrong. The house was silent, unnaturally so. Ethan called out, his voice trembling. "Mom? Elise?" No answer. He stepped into the living room, and his breath caught in his throat. A figure sat in the armchair by the window, its back turned to him. The figure was still, too still, and the shadows in the room seemed to cling to it like a second skin. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to leave, but his legs moved on their own, carrying him closer. When he was just a step away, the figure turned. It wasn't his mother. It wasn't human. Its face was a void, a featureless expanse of black that seemed to draw the light out of the room. A hollow voice emanated from the creature. "You let her go. Now it's your turn." Before Ethan could react, the figure lunged at him, its form stretching impossibly as it engulfed him in darkness. He screamed, but no sound escaped. The void pulled him deeper, suffocating him, until he woke up. Ethan was back in the chamber, gasping for air. The obelisk stood before him, unchanged, but his hands were shaking violently. He glanced around and saw his team scattered across the chamber, each frozen in place, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" Maria whispered, clutching her chest as though trying to steady her heart. Ethan couldn't answer. He didn't know how to explain what he had just experienced. But one thing was clear: this was no ordinary cave. It wasn't just a portal to nightmares. It was alive, feeding on their fears, and it wasn't done with them yet. The air inside the cave grew colder with every step Ethan and his team took, the chill biting at their skin like icy needles. The walls of the cavern seemed to close in, their jagged surfaces shifting imperceptibly, as though alive and watching. The only sound was the crunch of boots against loose gravel, but even that felt muffled, as if the cave itself were absorbing the noise, devouring any trace of their presence. Ethan's flashlight flickered again, the beam barely piercing the suffocating darkness. Ahead, the passage twisted sharply, and a faint red glow pulsed around the corner like a slow, dying heartbeat. He hesitated, instinctively gripping the cold steel of his flashlight tighter. "Stay close," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but the words felt heavy, weighed down by the oppressive silence. As they rounded the corner, the source of the glow came into view, a deep fissure in the ground, emanating an eerie, pulsating light. The jagged edges of the fissure seemed to hum with energy, and an unnatural warmth radiated from it, contrasting sharply with the icy air. Ethan crouched near the edge, peering down. The abyss seemed endless, and from its depths came a faint, rhythmic sound. It was not an echo, but something far worse, a low, guttural moan, like a creature breathing in its sleep. Maria stepped closer, her eyes wide and fixed on the fissure. "It's like it's alive," she murmured. Her voice trembled, and her breath fogged in the cold air. Before Ethan could respond, Greg let out a strangled gasp. "Did you hear that?" he said, spinning around, his flashlight darting across the walls. "Someone's here with us." Ethan froze. The cave had been eerily silent, but now faint whispers began to creep into the edges of their hearing. The voices were indistinct, overlapping and echoing, as though dozens of unseen figures were murmuring just out of sight. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he turned his light toward the darkness behind them. There was nothing there, just the endless black void of the cave. But then the whispers grew louder, forming fragmented words. "Turn back. Not safe. Your fears, they will find you." The team huddled closer together, their lights darting frantically across the walls. The carvings they had seen earlier now appeared different, more sinister. Figures twisted and contorted, their faces frozen in expressions of unimaginable agony. Ethan felt a cold sweat drip down his back as he realized the symbols were no longer just etched into the walls. They seemed to be moving, shifting ever so slightly, as if writhing in pain. A sudden noise shattered the tension, a distant scream, echoing from deeper within the cave. It wasn't one of theirs. The sound was shrill, raw, and filled with such visceral terror that it made Ethan's blood run cold. It came from somewhere far below, as though the abyss itself had birthed it. Greg took a step back, shaking his head. "This is wrong. We shouldn't be here." His voice cracked, and his flashlight trembled in his hand. Ethan opened his mouth to reply, but before he could speak, the ground beneath them trembled. The fissure pulsed violently, the red glow intensifying, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. Maria let out a cry as the warmth from the fissure turned into an unbearable heat. Then, the shadows began to move. At first, Ethan thought it was a trick of the light. But as he stared, he realized the darkness itself was shifting, stretching and twisting into unnatural shapes. One by one, the shadows peeled themselves away from the walls, forming tall, hunched figures with long, jagged limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. The figures didn't walk, they glided silently across the floor, their movements unnatural and jerky, like puppets pulled by invisible strings. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as one of them stopped and turned its eyeless gaze directly at him. "Run!" Ethan shouted, grabbing Maria's arm and pulling her away from the fissure. The team broke into a frantic sprint, their footsteps echoing like thunder through the narrow corridor. But no matter how fast they ran, the whispers followed them, growing louder, more insistent. The shadows gave chase, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness like predatory beacons. The passage twisted and turned, each corner revealing another stretch of endless black. Ethan's lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to keep moving. Behind him, Maria stumbled, letting out a cry of pain as she fell to her knees. Ethan skidded to a stop and turned back, his flashlight trembling as he shone it toward her. The shadows were closing in, their jagged limbs reaching out. Without thinking, Ethan lunged forward, grabbing Maria by the arm and pulling her to her feet. But as he did, one of the shadows reached out and grazed his shoulder. A searing pain shot through him, and for a brief moment his vision blurred. In that instant, he saw something, images flashing through his mind like a broken film reel. He saw his sister, Elise, standing at the edge of the abyss, her face pale and her eyes filled with fear. He saw himself reaching out to her, only for her to disappear into the darkness. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving Ethan gasping for air. The shadows were still advancing, but they stopped abruptly as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. And then, as if commanded by some unseen force, the shadows retreated, melting back into the walls. The whispers faded, and the cavern fell silent once more. Ethan and his team were left standing in the suffocating darkness, their breaths ragged and their bodies trembling. But Ethan knew the cave wasn't done with them. The shadows had let them go for now. Something deeper, something far worse, was waiting for them in the heart of the cave. And Ethan could feel it calling his name. The team stumbled into another chamber, gasping for air and clutching their sides. This new space was vast and hollow, with a ceiling so high that their flashlights couldn't reach it. Strange, phosphorescent fungi clung to the walls, casting an unsettling green glow that illuminated the chamber, just enough to reveal its grotesque details. Carvings filled every inch of the walls, showing twisted figures locked in endless torment. Some seemed to reach out from the stone, their faces frozen in silent screams, while others appeared to writhe in agony, their bodies half-formed as if trying to escape the confines of the rock. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, slick with a dark, viscous substance that glistened in the dim light. Ethan approached cautiously, every nerve in his body screaming for him to turn back. The altar emanated a deep, resonant hum, like the low growl of a slumbering beast. As he drew closer, he noticed a deep groove carved into its surface, forming a perfect circle filled with the same glowing symbols they had seen earlier. "I don't think we should be here," Greg muttered, his voice trembling as he edged toward the chamber's walls. Maria clung to her flashlight, her knuckles white as she scanned the room. "This place, it's waiting for something," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pulsing hum. Ethan placed a hand on the altar, and the room instantly reacted. The ground trembled violently, and the carvings on the walls began to glow, their light growing brighter and more erratic with each passing second. A sudden, piercing screech filled the air, a sound so raw and otherworldly that it made Ethan drop to his knees, clutching his ears. The glow from the altar intensified, blindingly bright, and Ethan felt himself being pulled forward, as if an invisible force was dragging him into the circle. He clawed at the stone, trying to resist, but the pull was relentless. The light enveloped him, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then he opened his eyes, and found himself in a place that defied comprehension. The chamber was gone. Ethan now stood in a vast, endless expanse of black, dotted with floating fragments of stone and twisted, otherworldly structures that seemed to stretch and warp as he moved. The air here was thick and heavy, each breath a struggle. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint echoes of his own footsteps, which sounded as though they were coming from miles away. But he wasn't alone. A faint figure emerged from the darkness ahead. At first, Ethan thought it was another hallucination, a trick of the light, but as it drew closer, he recognized the face. His sister, Elise. She looked exactly as she had the day she disappeared, her hair disheveled, her face pale, and her eyes wide with terror. But there was something off about her. Her movements were unnatural, jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "Elise?" Ethan's voice cracked as he took a hesitant step forward. She didn't respond. Instead, she raised a trembling hand and pointed behind him. Ethan turned slowly, his stomach knotting with dread. Behind him, shadows began to coalesce, forming a massive, grotesque figure. The creature was unlike anything he had ever seen, its body a writhing mass of black tendrils, its eyes glowing like molten embers. It towered over him, its form constantly shifting, as if it couldn't decide on a single horrifying shape. The creature spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from all directions. "You seek answers, but the price is your soul." Ethan stumbled back, his mind racing. He looked to Elise, but her expression remained blank, her fingers still pointing toward the creature. The ground beneath him began to crack, the fragments of stone floating into the void. The creature lunged, its tendrils reaching for him, and Ethan felt an unbearable cold grip his chest. Suddenly, he was back in the chamber, gasping for air and clutching his chest. His team was nowhere to be seen. The altar now stood silent, the glow from its symbols extinguished. Ethan stumbled to his feet, his mind reeling. The vision, or whatever it had been, felt too real, too visceral to dismiss as a dream. He called out for Maria and Greg, but only his echo answered him. The carvings on the walls seemed to watch him, their expressions now twisted into cruel smiles. Ethan's flashlight flickered, and in its dim beam, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A single, fresh handprint on the altar, larger than any human hand could possibly be. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and indistinct, but one phrase stood out clearly. "You are marked. It will follow you." Ethan's mind raced as the air around him grew colder. He wasn't sure what was more terrifying, the realization that he was utterly alone in the cave, or the knowledge that something else was down there with him. And it wasn't going to let him leave. Ethan staggered out of the chamber, the weight of the vision pressing down on him like an iron chain. The air felt heavier, suffused with a metallic tang that clung to his tongue. His heart raced as he whispered for Maria and Greg, but only silence greeted him. The cavern seemed to expand and contract with every step, the walls shifting subtly, as though the cave itself was alive and watching. The whispers, faint but constant, clung to his mind, threading into his thoughts like vines. He stumbled into a narrow passage and froze. A soft, glowing light pulsed at the end, faintly illuminating a grotesque mural carved into the stone. It wasn't like the others. This one was fresh, the markings glistening as though carved moments ago. Ethan's stomach churned as he realized it depicted him. His figure was unmistakable, holding a torch as shadowy tendrils wrapped around his limbs. Behind him, larger than life, loomed the creature he had seen in the vision. Its molten eyes seemed to burn with malice, even in the stillness of the stone. "What is this?" he muttered, his voice trembling. He reached out to touch the mural, and the moment his fingers brushed the cold surface, a rush of memories flooded his mind, memories that weren't his. He saw flashes of faces, pale and terrified, twisted in agony as they were pulled into the same abyss he had seen. He felt their fear, their despair, and their realization that escape was impossible. Each one bore the same glowing mark that now burned faintly on Ethan's chest, a reminder of his encounter with the altar. Suddenly, a sharp cry echoed through the cave, a voice unmistakably Maria's. Ethan snapped back to reality, adrenaline surging as he sprinted toward the sound. The tunnel narrowed, forcing him to squeeze through jagged rocks that tore at his jacket. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar in his ears. He emerged into a smaller chamber and froze. Maria was there, kneeling on the ground, her back to him. Her flashlight lay shattered beside her, its weak beam casting long, fractured shadows. She was muttering something under her breath, her voice barely audible. "Maria!" Ethan called, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. She didn't respond. As he approached, his stomach twisted in knots. Her body was rigid, her hands clutching her head as she rocked back and forth. When he got closer, he saw her eyes. They were wide and unblinking, pupils dilated to the point of almost erasing the color. "Maria," he said again, kneeling beside her and gently shaking her shoulder. She turned to him slowly, her lips trembling as she whispered, "It knows us, Ethan. It knows everything." Before he could ask what she meant, her gaze shifted behind him, and her face contorted in terror. "It's here," she choked out, pointing with a trembling finger. Ethan spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. At first, there was nothing. Then, from the far corner of the chamber, a low, guttural growl emerged. The light trembled in his hands as the shadows seemed to peel themselves from the walls, coalescing into a shape that defied logic. The creature was massive, its form writhing and shifting as though it couldn't hold a single shape. Its eyes burned like coals, fixed on Ethan with a hunger that sent chills down his spine. Gripping Maria's arm, Ethan pulled her to her feet. "We need to move," he hissed, his voice barely concealing his fear. Together, they stumbled out of the chamber, the creature's growls echoing behind them. As they ran, Ethan noticed something strange. The symbols on the walls, they were no longer glowing faintly but burning brightly, casting an eerie red light that seemed to guide their path. But the light wasn't comforting, it felt malevolent, as if the cave itself was pushing them deeper into its labyrinthine depths. Finally, they reached a small alcove, the narrow space offering a temporary reprieve from the suffocating darkness. Maria collapsed against the wall, her breathing ragged. "It's playing with us," she said, her voice trembling. "This place, it's alive. It feeds on us." Ethan leaned against the opposite wall, his mind racing. He pulled out the ancient map he had relied on to find the cave. The markings on it, once cryptic and unintelligible, now glowed faintly, forming shapes that hadn't been there before. He traced his finger along the map and realized with a sinking feeling that it didn't lead to an exit. It led to the altar. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The cave wasn't just a physical space. It was a trap, a living entity designed to lure and consume. The whispers weren't just random, they were warnings from those who had come before, their voices etched into the walls and air, forever echoing their despair. Ethan looked at Maria, who was staring blankly at the ground. Her face was pale, her lips trembling as she whispered, "It showed me everything. My fears, my regrets, my death." He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Maria, listen to me. We're gonna find a way out. We have to. This thing, it wants us to give up. That's how it wins." But even as he spoke, a chilling thought crept into his mind. The cave wasn't just feeding on their fear. It was learning from them, twisting their thoughts and memories into something far darker. And somewhere in the darkness, the creature waited, waiting for its moment to strike. The oppressive darkness seemed to thicken as Ethan and Maria pressed on, their footsteps echoing endlessly in the twisting passages of the cave. The air was heavy with moisture and carried an unsettling metallic tang, as though the walls themselves were bleeding. The faint glow of Ethan's flashlight was swallowed by the black void ahead, revealing nothing but fleeting glimpses of jagged stone and faint carvings that seemed to shift and writhe at the edge of his vision. Maria lagged behind, her breath shallow and uneven. Her whispers grew more fragmented, laced with panic. "It's watching us. It's in our heads," she muttered, clutching her chest as though the cave's weight pressed directly onto her heart. Ethan ignored her words, though they echoed the very fear clawing at the edges of his own sanity. He couldn't afford to give in, not yet. The tunnel narrowed abruptly, forcing them to squeeze through jagged rock formations. Ethan scraped his shoulder on the sharp edges, drawing blood that felt unnaturally cold as it trickled down his arm. The passage finally opened into a small chamber, where the air shifted subtly. It wasn't relief, it was a trap, he was certain of it. The chamber's walls were smoother, polished as though worn by centuries of unseen hands. In the center, a faintly glowing pool of water rippled, though there was no wind to disturb it. Maria stepped forward, mesmerized by the pool's ghostly light. Ethan grabbed her arm. "Don't," he warned, his voice sharp. But she shook him off, her wide eyes locked onto the water. "Do you hear it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan frowned. "Hear what?" "The voices," she whispered. "They're calling for me." Ethan listened intently, but all he could hear was the faint drip of water echoing in the cavern. Yet the longer he stared at the pool, the more he felt its pull. The ripples seemed to form patterns, faces twisted and agonized, rising and falling beneath the surface. His chest tightened as he recognized one of the faces. Elise. Before he could react, Maria stepped closer, kneeling at the pool's edge. "Maria, stop!" Ethan shouted, but it was too late. Her hand dipped into the water, and the ripples exploded outward, sending a shockwave through the chamber. The smooth walls began to crack, black veins spreading like a disease. A low, guttural moan filled the air, vibrating deep within their bones. Maria screamed and fell backward, clutching her hand. Her skin was pale and blistered, and black lines crept up her arm, pulsing like veins filled with poison. "It burns," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Ethan grabbed her, pulling her away from the pool as the cracks in the walls widened, revealing a pulsating red light that seemed to throb in time with the whispers growing louder around them. Suddenly, the chamber shifted. The ground beneath their feet began to tilt, sending loose rocks tumbling into the glowing pool. Ethan held Maria tightly as they scrambled toward the far wall, where a narrow crevice offered an escape. The whispers turned into screams, overlapping voices that seemed to claw at their minds. "You cannot leave," they hissed. "You belong to us." Ethan pushed Maria into the crevice first, following close behind as the chamber collapsed behind them. The walls groaned and trembled, and the air grew colder with every step they took. They emerged into another tunnel, narrower and more claustrophobic than the last. The darkness here was deeper, almost tangible, and the faint glow from Ethan's flashlight barely pierced it. "Ethan," Maria whispered, her voice shaking. I can't go on. It's in me." She held up her arm, and Ethan's stomach churned. The black veins had spread to her shoulder, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. Her eyes were glassy, distant, as though something else was looking through them. "We don't stop," Ethan said firmly, though his voice betrayed his fear. "We keep moving. We find a way out." But deep down, he wasn't sure there was a way out. The cave seemed endless, its corridors twisting and looping back on themselves, leading them deeper into its malevolent heart. The whispers never stopped, growing louder and more insistent, filling Ethan's mind with fragmented images of his past, Elisa's face, pale and terrified, the twisted creature that loomed over him, the altar, glowing with an otherworldly light. And then he heard it, a second set of footsteps. They were faint but distinct, following close behind them. Ethan spun around, his flashlight sweeping the darkness, but there was nothing there. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Maria nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's following us." The footsteps grew louder, closer, accompanied by the sound of labored breathing. Ethan tightened his grip on Maria's arm, pulling her forward. "Run," he whispered, his voice trembling. They ran blindly, their footsteps echoing in the endless void. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in as if the cave itself was trying to trap them. The footsteps behind them quickened, and the breathing turned into a guttural growl. Ethan glanced over his shoulder and froze. In the faint beam of his flashlight, he saw it, a shadowy figure, its form shifting and writhing as it moved. Its eyes glowed like embers, fixed on him with a hunger that chilled him to his core. "It's here," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan tightened his grip on her hand and forced himself to move. The tunnel opened into another chamber, but this one was different. The walls were covered in mirrors, tall, distorted panes of glass that reflected their terrified faces. The creature appeared in the mirrors, its form twisting and expanding, filling every reflection. Ethan turned to face it, but the chamber was empty. "It's not real," he said, trying to convince himself. "It's not real." But as he stared into the mirror, his own reflection began to change. His face twisted into a grotesque smile, his eyes dark and hollow. The reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass. Ethan stumbled back, his mind reeling. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and deafening, as the reflection spoke. "You cannot escape. This is your prison." Ethan fell to his knees, clutching his head as the whispers consumed him. The cave wasn't just alive, it was a predator, and they were its prey. And it was only a matter of time before it claimed them both. Ethan dragged Maria forward, her body weakened by the spreading black veins that now climbed her neck, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. Her breaths were shallow, and her movements sluggish, as if the life was being siphoned from her. They stumbled into another chamber, this one vast and eerily silent, the air so heavy it felt like they were breathing water. The oppressive quiet was more unnerving than the whispers. It was the calm before something unspeakable. The chamber was unlike any they had seen before. The walls, smooth as glass, reflected faint, distorted images of Ethan and Maria. But the reflections didn't match their movements. Ethan froze as he noticed his mirrored self staring back at him, unmoving, its hollow eyes boring into his soul. He looked away quickly, his pulse hammering in his ears. At the center of the chamber stood a massive stone archway, ancient and cracked, glowing faintly with the same ominous red light that seemed to follow them. The symbols etched into its surface pulsed like a heartbeat, and the air around it shimmered, distorting the space like a heat wave. It was the source of everything, the whispers, the shadows, the creature. This was the heart of the nightmare. Maria collapsed to her knees, clutching her chest as the veins on her skin pulsed brighter. "It's calling me," she gasped, her voice weak. "I can feel it inside. It wants to take me." Ethan knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. "We're not letting it win," he said firmly, though fear clawed at his resolve. He couldn't lose her, not like Elise. He turned his gaze to the archway, his mind racing. If this was the source, then there had to be a way to stop it. Suddenly, the silence shattered. A deep, guttural roar echoed through the chamber, shaking the very ground beneath them. The reflections on the walls began to move, their distorted forms writhing and twisting. Ethan's reflection smiled, a grotesque, predatory grin that sent chills down his spine. From the shadows beyond the archway, the creature emerged. It was larger now, its form more defined but no less horrifying. Its body was a mass of writhing tendrils, constantly shifting and reshaping, as if it could never settle on one shape. Its molten eyes burned with malevolent intelligence, fixed on Ethan and Maria like a predator savoring its prey. "You've come far," the creature growled, its voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "But you cannot leave. This place is you. Your fears, your regrets, your failures. You brought them here, and now they belong to me." Ethan stood, his legs trembling, but his determination unwavering. "You don't control us," he spat. "We're not your playthings." The creature laughed, a sound that reverberated through the chamber like the grinding of stone. "You think you have a choice? You crossed the threshold the moment you entered. The portal does not let go." Ethan's mind raced as the creature advanced, its tendrils stretching out, filling the chamber with darkness. He looked at Maria, who was barely holding on, and then back at the archway. The symbols pulsed brighter as the creature drew closer, as if feeding off their fear. And then he realized fear was the key. The creature thrived on it, used it to trap and manipulate them. But what if they fought back? What if they refused to give in? Ethan turned to Maria. "You need to trust me," he said, his voice steady. "We can beat this, but you have to let go of the fear. It's the only way." Maria looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt and terror. "I can't," she whispered. "It's inside me." "Yes, you can," Ethan insisted, gripping her hand. "It's lying to you. It's lying to both of us. Fight it." The creature roared again, its tendrils lashing out. Ethan pulled Maria to her feet and stepped in front of her, shielding her from the oncoming darkness. The tendrils stopped inches from his face, hovering as though confused. Ethan stared into the creature's burning eyes. "You don't scare me," he said, though his heart pounded in his chest. "Not anymore." The chamber trembled violently, and the creature let out a deafening screech. The symbols on the archway pulsed erratically, and the red light grew brighter, bathing the room in an otherworldly glow. The reflections on the walls twisted into grotesque shapes, their faces screaming silently as they tried to break free. Maria stepped forward, her breaths coming faster as the veins on her skin began to recede. She placed her hand on Ethan's shoulder, her voice trembling but steady. "You're right. It only has power if we give it power." The creature recoiled, its form flickering and distorting. "No," It roared, its voice layered with countless others, each one filled with desperation. "You cannot defy me." Ethan and Maria stepped closer to the archway, their fear replaced by a growing sense of resolve. The creature lunged, its tendrils flailing wildly, but they passed through Ethan and Maria as though they were nothing but shadows. Standing before the archway, Ethan placed his hand on the pulsing symbols. The light intensified, blinding them both. The creature screamed, its voice reverberating through the chamber as its form began to collapse, shrinking into itself. The ground beneath them cracked, and the chamber began to implode. Ethan grabbed Maria's hand, pulling her toward a faint glow that appeared at the far end of the room. The archway shattered behind them, and the creature's final roar faded into silence. They stumbled out of the cave and into the pale light of dawn. The air was crisp, the oppressive weight of the cave lifted. Ethan turned to Maria, who looked pale but alive. The black veins were gone, and her breathing was steady. Ethan glanced back at the cave entrance, now sealed by fallen rocks. The symbols were gone, and the whispers had faded. But deep in his gut, he knew the cave wasn't truly gone. It was waiting, watching, for the next unwitting souls to enter its grasp. "It's over," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head, his gaze fixed on the cave. "No," he said. "It's never over." Ethan and Maria stood in the pale morning light, their breath visible in the cold air. The oppressive darkness of the cave was gone, but its presence lingered, clinging to their minds like a shadow that couldn't be shaken. The jagged rocks that now sealed the entrance stood silent and immovable, as if the earth itself had conspired to bury the nightmare within. Yet, Ethan knew better. The cave wasn't buried, it was waiting. The silence outside was deafening. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The forest, once dense with life, felt hollow, like a painting that only imitated reality. Ethan looked to Maria, who sat against a tree, staring blankly into the distance. Her hands trembled as she traced invisible patterns on her arms, where the black veins had once pulsed. She hadn't spoken since they escaped, and her silence gnawed at Ethan's nerves. "We're alive," Ethan said, breaking the stillness, though his voice felt small against the vast emptiness around them. "We made it out." Maria didn't respond. Her eyes were glassy, distant, fixed on something Ethan couldn't see. When he crouched beside her, she whispered, "Did we? Or did it let us go?" The question sent a chill through him. He had felt it too, a sense that their escape hadn't been a victory but a concession, like the cave had grown bored of their resistance and decided to toy with them another day. His hand instinctively went to his chest, where the faint warmth of the glowing mark still lingered beneath his skin. He had hoped it was gone, but deep down he knew the truth: he was marked. Ethan pulled out the tattered map he had carried into the cave. The symbols that had once been indecipherable now burned brightly, etched into his memory as clearly as they were on the paper. But the map had changed. The path no longer led to the cave. Instead, it branched out, leading to other places, other locations marked with the same ominous runes. "What is this?" he muttered, his voice trembling. Maria finally looked at the map, her eyes widening with fear. "It's not over," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's spreading." Ethan folded the map quickly, shoving it into his bag as if hiding it could erase the reality they faced. But the unease in his chest grew. The cave had been alive, sentient, feeding on their fears, and it wasn't alone. If this map was accurate, it was only one of many. As they began their descent from the mountain, the weight of their ordeal pressed heavier with each step. Ethan couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, though every time he turned, there was nothing but trees and mist. Maria clung to him now, her strength drained, but her gaze darted nervously at every sound. Branches creaking, the rustle of leaves, even their own footsteps seemed unnatural. "Do you hear them?" Maria whispered suddenly, stopping in her tracks. Ethan froze, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then, faint and almost imperceptible, he heard it, whispers. They were distant, carried on the breeze, but unmistakably the same voices they had heard in the cave. "It's just the wind," Ethan lied, trying to reassure her, but his words rang hollow. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though chasing them down the mountainside. When they reached the forest's edge, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The sudden stillness made Ethan's skin crawl. He turned to Maria, who was pale and trembling. "Do you feel it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. "It's not just the cave. It's out here now." Their surroundings felt different. The forest, the air, even the light, it all seemed warped, like a faint reflection of reality. Ethan glanced at the trees, their bark covered in faint, glowing symbols. He hadn't noticed them before, but now they were everywhere, etched into the landscape like a disease spreading through the earth itself. As they reached their vehicle, Ethan hesitated. The metal was cold beneath his fingers as he gripped the door, but the reflection in the window made him pause. His own face stared back at him, but something was wrong. His eyes, faintly glowing red, locked onto his own with a malice that wasn't his. He blinked, and the reflection was normal again, but the unease remained. "Ethan?" Maria's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. She was already inside, looking at him with concern. He nodded and climbed into the driver's seat, starting the engine. The hum of the vehicle was a comfort, a reminder of the normal world they were desperate to return to. But as they drove down the winding mountain road, the silence between them grew heavier. Maria finally broke it. "It's not going to stop, is it?" Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "No," he admitted. "But we will. We'll stop it." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her expression hardening. "Then we fight," she said. As they drove further from the mountain, the whispers faded, replaced by the distant hum of civilization. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped, that the cave had left its mark on them, and its reach extended far beyond its walls. In the rearview mirror, the mountain loomed in the distance, shrouded in mist. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw movement at its base, shadows stretching and writhing as if waving goodbye. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it as exhaustion, but the feeling lingered. They didn't speak the rest of the way. When they reached the edge of the nearest town, Maria broke the silence one last time. "Do you think it's still with us?" Ethan glanced at her, then back at the road. "I don't know," he said, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "But I think we're with it." The camera pans to the vehicle disappearing into the distance, the mountain standing silent and unmoving behind them. But as the screen fades to black, faint whispers rise again, leaving the audience with a single haunting thought. The nightmare is never truly over.